Hi, everyone, and welcome to In the Spirit, where we bring together leaders who are right in the thick of change in cloud native observability and now AI. I'm Sophie Kohler, and I'm thrilled to kick off the very first session 2026 Predictions, the Future of AI in Observability. Over the last year, AI has gone from side project to center stage, but as investments ramp up, the big questions for 2025 and beyond are shifting from can we use AI to can we trust it, run it reliably, and prove it's delivering real business impact. In this session, we'll explore where AI has genuinely delivered, where it's fallen short, and ultimately what executives should prioritize going into the new year. So, from Chronosphere, we have Martin Mao, our co founder and CEO, who works with organizations that are trying to get their increasingly complex cloud native environments under control. And joining us from ThoughtWorks, we have CTO for the Americas, Thomas Squayo, who helps large enterprises modernize their platforms and operationalize AI for real business impact. So, with that, let's jump into the very first question. Martin and Thomas, you've both had a front row seat in 2025 working with customers across industries as they experiment with AI and application development. So, when you look back at this past year, what are the biggest surprises or inflection points you've seen that could be good or bad that should shape how executives in the room think about AI and observability going into 2026? Martin, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Great to be here. Thomas, great to be chatting with you today. Surprises or inflection points? I think for me, for 2025, one of maybe the surprises is with the models, the big foundational models that have been built. At least what we've seen is that the difference between the versions of a model or the difference between the models have definitely come down from what they were in 2024 or the year before. I remember these new models used to be huge step size increases in capabilities and performance and accuracy. Whereas I think in 25, again, at least from my personal vantage point, I've seen less differences between both new versions and between the models there where, internally where we use these various models, we can almost switch them out and get pretty similar results for a lot of these B2B use cases that we're looking at. So that was at least a surprise for me. And I think it shows that we're getting to some type of diminishing returns on the capabilities of the models. Of course, they're going to keep getting better, but I think not in the same order of magnitude type of way. And I think that was both surprising and also sort of informed us that, perhaps the innovation is outside of just what the core models can provide. And the focus can be, potentially on the application on top, or perhaps the quality of the data that is being fed into these models as well. So for me, that's probably the biggest surprise. And for me, the inflection point, which is probably not surprise to most folks, is AI agents. I think 2025 was definitely the year of agentic workflows and AI agents. And I think, we're starting to see the 25 for me, and at least the companies that I talked to, is a lot of experimentation and trust building in these. And I think as we go into the new year, it will probably, move more towards production use cases and a lot more agents being deployed in production. But that's what I'm seeing. Thomas, we'll love to hear from you if you're seeing something similar or different surprises or inflection points.
No, thank you, Martin. I think that from our view and my view, it's not only are we seeing a lot of innovations around kind of things that are in the inference consumption, but I think that some of the innovations that we've seen are in the high performance computing, the application of platform engineering, on not only just the continuous pre-training, model post-training, the fine-tuning activities that are going on there, but when you start to get it into the inference, now you're starting to see different architectural patterns around AI. I would consider agents an architectural pattern from that view. And what it also has introduced, I think the biggest inflection point was the realization that security needs to be taken in a completely different context. I think that if you think about kind of the platform engineering, the high performance computing, the notion of security, policy as code, and looking at how that flows through, it fits very much into the observability story being kind of a first principle for any of these environments being able to be trusted at scale. And I think that when we think about what we're seeing is kind of moving from agents to agentic to multi-agent systems, to seeing the complexity there, it becomes kind of a management around the context window and inference optimization at that point. So All of these are, understanding what's happening in that system, inspecting what you expect, making sure that you could actually deliver on the SLAs, and then also ensure not only, your token cost is actually in line with what your expectations are, but also not, negatively impacting your threat surface or your security posture.
And Thomas, I don't know if it's the same for you, but it feels like the same, security, observability, the same concepts that we've had to deal with forever. It just feels like they've come up again, and we need to sort of tackle these challenges and reinvent solutions for age old problems that we've been going through for a very long time now.
Plus one, matter of fact, so it's interesting from my view, what we're seeing is a convergence of observability, monitoring, SecOps being part of that conversation in a way that, where, I'm, to date myself a little bit, I mean, I've seen it where, APM was kind of the du jour, logging, tracing, things like that, OTel, all those things that you start to see become part of your SecOps story in a much more sophisticated way. When you think about just notion of like guardrails and understanding what a guardrail strike could do to your business, when you think like model drift or model poisoning and understanding how that fits into things, those are going to be much more material when you have a non-deterministic actor inside your system working on behalf of the user. So we're seeing, enterprises when they're dealing with kind of the middle loop. So inner loop being kind of that notion of developer experience and, product lifecycle, middle loop being those business processes and operations. In that middle loop, we start to see, kind of not only the role-based access control, but an agent-based access control come together, and having the observability understanding when those guardrail strikes might happen is something that's material before anybody goes into that outer loop and puts it out into general consumption for stakeholders.
Awesome. Cool. Let's zoom in a little more into where many teams have felt AI most directly so far, the developer workflow. So, developers have seen some real benefits when it comes to AI generated code and productivity. Do we expect to see the same on the operational side of the business?
Yeah, I would say if you look at the pattern of these things, I can't see an outcome where we don't, because if you think about obviously the initial investment into generating more code, I think at right now, a lot more percentage of code is being AI generated, and just a lot more overall code is being generated and deployed in production. So if you look at that pattern, I don't see how we don't counterbalance that on the other side with all of the operational pieces that go along with it, which included observability, but also ultimately operating that piece of software in production. And if you play it out, I don't see a world in which the production of code slows down, and I don't see a world in which we can only have humans continue to run and support these things in production. So if you extrapolate that, I do think that pretty soon there'll be even more pressure than there is today to go automate a lot of the operational pieces. And I think as companies and humans will probably get to that point pretty quickly, because it's, to me, if you trust these AI agents to go write that code for you, and you trust it to deploy that code into production, I think very quickly there will be trust built into sort of also operating that piece of software as well.
Yeah, I think that where we're seeing, so I think that the dev productivity is definitely real. I think that what we're seeing is that more application of AI into things like AI SRE, AI ops, those things are very much part of the notion of like where it's already helping operations within ThoughtWorks. We have a managed service offering that we deliver on behalf of our clients, and we're seeing it in faster triage and root cause, better decision support. So if you remember, one of the big problems that APM had was this notion of event storming, where you would have a single event that had a cascading set of activities across your system. AI can make sense of that, be able to normalize and be able to pull out some of the intelligence around those things. And then what we start to see now is this notion of like, what does it mean from, not only being able to support the SLAs and be able to deal with things that are in the DORA metrics around things like MTTR and detect and diagnose, but also what is the, cost and efficiency hygiene associated with it. So what does it mean? Like, where is waste occurring? Where is, like noisy dependencies happening or over provisioned resources? All those, I look to our observability platforms to be able to tell us that before we actually start to, make decisions about how things are going to be rolled out and how they're going to be. Like, I think that almost everything about the system needs to be understood as it's malleable. Nothing is fixed anymore. So we have this almost like every decision needs to be weighted based on what you're seeing in a production environment. And I think that the last area I think about it is just this notion of like, if in development, it's always been about speed, and then in operations, it's about clarity. And I think that if you think about that, if you give operations teams clarity faster, that moves, uptime, optimizes cost. All of those dimensions are kind of key to being able to be considered to be a successful I&O operator, in that regard. So.
Nice. Thomas, I don't know if I've heard that before, but I love it. For development, it's all about speed. For operations, it's all about clarity. I like that. Yeah.
It's a great tagline or motto. So yeah, you've painted a hopeful picture about what's possible on the operational side. And there have been some clear benefits in harnessing AI, but I'm curious to know, where has it actually fallen short this past year?
For me, where it's fallen short, and we're obviously in the observability space, so we look at a lot of LLM and AI application to the observability problem here. One of the areas where we've seen it be where we've seen AI fall short a little bit, and perhaps it's outside of observability as well, is I don't know if you experience this concept where if you ask an LLM like ChatGPT a question, you generally get back an answer. Ignoring hallucinations, you'll get back an answer. I don't think I've ever once asked it something where it said, I don't know, like I'm not confident or anything. You get this pretty plausible answer back. And of course, it's doing its best based on the knowledge it has, the data it has, the context it has to provide you that answer. And I would say in certain use cases where it's very matter of fact, like you're asking it for, a piece of data you can find on Wikipedia, it's probably pretty highly accurate there. But I would say in use cases like observability, where the answer is fairly complex, like what is the root cause here? Where it's not something that's obvious. It's not something in the underlying training data, because all of our environments are very different. I think this almost confidence and plausibility in the answer the LLMs gives is perhaps one of the shortfalls of it. And when we see some of the dangers of just perhaps taking, let's say, raw observability data or raw incident data and just feeding it to the LLMs and saying, what do you think the root cause is? It's never going to say, I don't know. It's always going to give you something that, again, sounds plausible based on the information it has. But what we found is that often, at least in our domain, often that isn't really the root cause, because the model doesn't have all the context, it doesn't have all the data to actually give you the actual root cause. And instead, it sends you on a little bit of a chase based on the information that it has. So, I don't know, Thomas, I'd love to hear from you if there's something you see even outside of the observability space. But I do think love to see the models get to a point where they give you some type of like confidence indicator or score, or like some more context on like how it came up with a particular answer or suggestion, and where maybe some of the gaps are, because we found that to be one of the gaps we're downfall this year.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think that where it felt short was around kind of the threat surface. I mean, security, quality of AI generated code. I think that if you have engineers that have the first principles and practices kind of confidently in their domain, the notion is that they can understand when they're in a current versus when they're just on an ice flow drifting with the current.
Yeah.
They know what the practices are, how they're actually going to support and apply those techniques to be able to have better outcomes. I think that those are whether you look at static testing or dynamic testing, I think that there's a where it fell down in some of the security and quality. I think it's an opportunity for us to be able to do different kind of test-driven design and in the application of AI. I think the other area that we found that was problematic was this, what we call kind of like pilot purgatory, or the POC madness, where you're like constantly in this POC, and then as soon as you get up to the front door of being able to move it into production, it starts to become like, oh, well, this was locally optimized for a very small subset of use cases. that becomes kind of where, executives have a fiduciary responsibility to understand the underpinning data that's driving these systems is actually critical for them to be successful, which leads you to kind of like governance. What does it look like from a data strategy? What's your data governance? What's the data readiness, and so on and so forth? Because a lot of these programs, like, unless they're like a generic chatbot, and you could do RAG or some fine tuning in there, but ultimately the data that you're going to be doing that fine tuning with is so much more critical at this point, because now it's like there are practices that were under invested that now are critical, that now require a significant additional investment over top of it. And I think that if in 2025 AI made individuals faster, it failed to make any systems safer or fewer systems were safer or more effective. And I think that's where, observability and disciplined engineering, I'll always hark back to kind of the first principle mechanics around software engineering and engineering. And if you think about that as it moves into an operational state, observability is key to that story. So from my view.
Yeah, I would love to plus one on a lot of things there, and to what you said first about going with the flow. It is generally from our approach perspective, we found that to be more effective of rather than have the LLMs like look at the raw unnormalized data and try to garner anything from it, almost replicate how a human will go solve the problem, right? Like a human would not just go look at the raw observability data. They'd be asking higher level questions like, hey, for this service, what are my dependencies? Where am I deployed? What's the infrastructure I run on? And these are sort of high level order of questions in which a human is trying to answer. And it's actually far more effective for us to get the AI agents or the LLMs to answer those questions, have access to the data in the right way to answer those questions and sort of explore and debug a problem as a human would, as opposed to a very different approach. And to your point, the underpinnings of all of that is actually better quality of data. And for most organizations, actually observability is one of the areas where your data is the least normalized and clean, right? Like every developer is instrumenting in their own unique particular way. So we have found a huge correlation in how effective the results you can get is highly correlated to how clean and normalized and standardized your data is. And we also know that the base instrumentation of that is never clean and normalized. So a lot of effort goes into sort of that process of cleaning up that data in order to make any of the outcomes more effective.
In a previous life, just having an agreement on what metrics meant was important. Like I was in an organization where we had an unwieldy amount of observability tools. And what ended up happening was we were never able to get down to just one. We were able to get down to fewer. And by getting down to fewer, what we had to also do is get into this notion of what does this mean when it's in this system? How does an operator actually make decisions on this based on what they're seeing coming off the telemetry of the system?
Yep. And you can imagine that is that part of it to get alignment on which metrics matter and what does it mean. And then there's also the mechanics of then, okay, taking all the raw data in its raw form and how do you sort of transform it into that view so everyone can see it, because it's often, what we found is often hard. Like if you have an agreement on some of those core signals, it's actually quite hard to get everybody to go back and re-instrument the custom applications and things like that. So there's almost this like transformation process. It's more effective, I would say, ad hoc after the fact to transform and normalize a lot of that data into those common signals that everyone agrees on.
Yeah, common signals first, and then business outcomes second. I think that's kind of the way I would look at it. Because otherwise, like if you can't agree on the common signals, then ultimately you're just like you don't have a version of version of truth. So.
Yeah.
Wow, you guys are like 10 steps ahead. We're already talking about the solutions. But I wanted to take a step back here, Martin. You had mentioned this topic of the gap in AI's promise and its reality. And it seems like that's where a lot of leadership conversations are. If we look at ThoughtWorks' this recent Looking Glass 2025 report, it stresses that the next phase of AI adoption is about operationalizing it for real business impact. So if we fast forward a year from now, how much do we think the business impact will actually be realized? And where do you think we'll really be?
I don't know how easy it's going to answer the exact quantification of business impact there, but I would say what's exciting for me is I think a lot of where the energy and the investment is going into is moving up the AI stack. And what I mean by that is, if you think about 2, 3 years ago, there was a huge focus, and it's still a focus on chips, but it's huge focus on like, okay, well, if you have the most powerful chips, that's what's going to make all of the difference. And I think yes, they're still coming up with new chips right now, but the delta between I think is less impactful. And then perhaps a year or 2 years ago, then we went to the models, like the better model, the more parameters the model has, the better the output would be. And again, I think as I talked about earlier, I do think we are starting to see less differences for each new version of a model, or less differences between the models. And then with all of that, I think actually a lot of the investment, both from like a venture capital perspective, but also from like a brain power perspective, is now moving up the stack into perhaps the applications and the uses of these models that we built, on a lot of these high performing chips. And I do think as the focus moves up the stack, it's more correlated with business impact and outcomes and value, right? It's very hard to correlate a more high performing chip directly to the business impact. There's so many layers in between. So I think for me, the thing that's exciting about where I think there will be more business impact is a lot more of the energy in the industry is moving up the stack to a lot of these applications and tools. And hence, I think that could only, it would be much easier to directly impact and correlate with business impact from that perspective. But Thomas, we'll love your take there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we see is like, most of our conversations are about modernization, data and AI implementation, and things like that. When we talk about data and AI implementation, or essentially whether it be agentic or otherwise, it's always in the inference side of the equation. So when we start to get into a lot of our conversations about how not only do I think AI adoption will be broad, but the measured impact is going to be somewhat uneven, because what happens is that there's notions of like, there was a small language model, to your point, a small language model might be the innovation. There is less differentiation in the models, because what ends up happening is that some of the innovations are happening in the high performance computing space. But I think that if we think about kind of how this actually gets realized, you're going to see enterprises take a smaller swings at more achievable outcomes, and be able to have that be incrementally delivered. I'm not so much as an AGI skeptic as I much just want to say, hey, there's this notion of like a super model is probably going to be less achievable than a domain specific or a small language model that is really kind of applied to be able to deliver the outcome. And then if I think about like how that would actually be done, is like, you're starting to see those teams that are able to set achievable outcomes with alignment to a business and cross-functional teams, turn AI plus observability into kind of operating advantage. And what we see is like, a very clear separation between the tooling that an engineer is going to have, the tooling that an operator is going to have, operations or business process owner, versus the, I now have an AI-enabled tool that faces my customer. And each one of those have different kind of dimensionality. I mean, I think that the middle and outer loop, from my view, is where observability becomes that much more critical. In the inner loop, it's like, it's instrument at inception is, I think, the key kind of way of thinking about how that actually has to be part of your story. So, when I think about kind of what I see in 2026 is this notion of things becoming more real, but they're becoming more kind of, the perimeters of them are more achievable than the kind of the broad POC mandates that I saw in 2025.
I would say there's definitely a lot more lower hanging fruit and value we can bring before achieving AGI, right? Like there's, there's the ultimate thing, and there's so much low hanging fruit, I think, especially in the enterprise, in business, that can be achieved and gain so much value before, we get to that step.
Well, you made a comment earlier about kind of this notion of, be able to have something that's very specific. I think that if you think about the memory layer or the experience layer that's overlaid on top of whatever that model is, becomes that much more valued, because the underpinning models could largely be changed up. I mean, like we saw, Claude come out with a game changing model, Gemini come out with a game changing model, DeepSeek's innovation on the HPC side. Like each of these things all happened in 2025. We're looking back over, what where true internet time is starting to come back to us in the scope and scale of changes. I say this pretty regularly. Is today's product is tomorrow's feature, and the experience layer is ultimately where you are going to differentiate as an enterprise. And how you fit AI into that story depends on what you're trying to accomplish. If you're an operator, you're having to enable that whatever level and layer that you're actually delivering upon. But the thing is that that's the common thread.
So you both kind of touched on your predictions for the following year, but if we kind of dive into observability and AI specifically, what are your top predictions for how AI-driven observability will actually change the way enterprises run, govern, and de-risk their production system? And then a second question under that is, do you think organizations are prepared to achieve this themselves, or will they need additional support?
Um, I mean, I'm, to what we talked about earlier, I do think, if we think about 2026, I do think there'll be a lot more dependency and lean onto sort of more AI powered tools to go govern and run everyone's production systems for sure. Whether companies need help, I think what they're going to realize, and Thomas and I have been talking about this for a while, I think what they're going to realize pretty quickly is regardless of the tool that you apply, the bigger different and those tools can switch out the models they're using and whatnot. The bigger I think difference is going to be in that data layer and how clean and how normalized perhaps that data layer is, in particular on the observability side. And I think that's where perhaps companies could use some help because I can imagine for most companies they just have not been thinking about this problem at all. It might be quite actually easy in the next year to go get some, observability or AI tools that can help you with this. I think the bigger differentiator will be how you manage and perhaps get help on that data layer, because I think that's going to be the bigger correlation to better outcomes as opposed to the tool necessarily that you apply on top.
Yeah, I would agree, and I also think that if you think about kind of like what AI is bringing to the table for troubleshooting, understanding kind of how it's being applied, I think that it's less about the tool and it's more about the practices that are being applied to it. So when we get engaged by our customers, very rarely do we start a conversation about what tools or tech or models or so on and so forth. It's about what is the business outcome that you're trying to drive from it. And if I think about from like, an I&O standpoint, it's like, AI becomes part of how you're going to guide the troubleshooting associated with these systems. If you think about the, we've had new standards, A2P, A2A, MCP, all released this year. That now means that observability is starting to become like a first class consideration in this work. And, we have seen this in the wild. We've worked with not only the foundation models, but we've also worked with key chip manufacturers and kind of the deployment of their solutions. And just by the notion of having been through these things in real production and out, where significant amounts of revenue are at stake or significant outcomes are at stake, that gives us the comfort to being able to go and say, look, we're not going to advise you and steer you towards necessarily this tool or that tool as much as what's the capability that you need to enable for your organization, and then be able to have the confidence, because I'm engaged just as regularly by CISOs as I am by CTOs. And the CISO and CDAO, those roles are collapsing to have almost very little daylight between the two of them. And what I didn't expect in 2025 was how much of my time was going to be on the security story. And that was something that it's fine, but we still come back to how do you get an understanding of what the threat surface is. And it's not only a combination of what the CISO's domains are around SecOps, but it's also around like, what are we doing in the app? What are we doing in the network? What are we doing in the ways that people are engaging with those? And ultimately, you have to have that telemetry to be able to get that understanding. And I think that's kind of a key reason why we've been working with organizations like Chronosphere and seeing them from the start of the journey to their current state.
Awesome. So with more investment and more automation, comes more risk and naturally more need for control. So I'm wondering, as investments in AI rise, like deploying agents or training models, there's a growing need in the industry to implement guardrails. What role do you think observability will play in providing those guardrails?
I think we've been talking about this already. I think observability plays a huge role there. We touch upon some of the pieces that are pretty obvious from both like performance, latency, accuracy perspective, and obviously also on the security side, especially with access management, with non-deterministic agents now running around these environments and whatnot. I think the one for me about and those are pretty obvious places where I think we need guardrails. One, and Thomas, you touched upon this earlier. One concept of guardrails that has been new and interesting to me, and maybe not obvious, is the cost one a little bit, because now you have these non-deterministic agents that are doing work, and the work cost dollars at the end of the day in terms of tokens there. I think for the first time, I don't know about the first time in history, but for perhaps the first time, a lot of these agents are potentially replacing work a human would do. It's an interesting concept where for a human, people have fixed salaries and they're doing work for a period of time, and it's a pretty predictable known amount of cost for that piece of work. Whereas all of a sudden, as you get to agents, especially multi-agents, a lot of these agents are doing things in parallel. The sort of predictability and the control of the cost of that work, even though it can potentially get it done much quicker, there is a new almost dimension that we've not had to think about for a while, because it's just assumed in our mind that that sort of vector of cost has been human war clock time and salaries, and now that has now potentially exploded. So it's very interesting that we talk to a lot of companies about sort of, yes, observing the performance, the latencies, the accuracies, helping with all the security use cases. Actually, cost governance, especially with agents, has been a hot topic. And you can imagine there's this concept where, like, yes, perhaps I can get this agent to do this piece of work for me, but like, how much am I willing to pay for that piece of work? I don't think a lot of folks think about that they only look at the benefits without thinking about the cost, and the cost is hard to predict up front. So that's always been an interesting one for me as we think about guardrails into this AI age. But yeah, Thomas, we'd love your thoughts here as well.
I think that token cost is part of the FinOps story. I think when we think about AI ops or what it means to manage things in their runtime, that's obviously part of it. I think of guardrails in three kind of verbs: observe, understand, and control. And if you have those three, then you can operate in control. I used to work for a global CIO, and his measure of success was: are you operating in control? Are you making decisions based on the outcomes that need to be driven? Your point about kind of the clock speed of the work hour for a human being is very different. So if you think about kind of the context window for an AI agent, there's this notion of people have right now, there's kind of a vision around, I have an always on agent. Well, that means that's an always consuming token. There's a cost associated with that. And there's a difference between, do you get that from a CSP? Are you getting that from a neocloud provider? Are you getting that from your own infrastructure? And to the early question about where does ThoughtWorks have an opinion around these things? It's this notion of, hey, how are we going to optimize your inference? Does this need to be, should you be hosting your own model? Should you be using a CSP? Should be using a neocloud provider? How is that going to fit into what your outcomes that you want to be able to drive? But I think if you think about kind of like, from an observability, is where is it being used? What models are being used? What prompts are being used? How are you overlaying your data into that system via either RAG or fine tuning or model post training? When you think about this, use of AI for, supporting the INO or the AI SRE function, what is an anomaly or what's an unsafe pattern? That we would call that a guardrail strike. What happened? How are you going to react? How are you going to be able to ensure that you're able to react quickly? So, for example, if you only have a kind of a governance process that reviews your guardrail strikes once a month and it's costing you a lot of money, that's not fast enough to be able to move that reaction speed. So you need to understand and be able to kind of compartmentalize or essentially control for that blast radius very quickly. And that gives you the ability to now do things like auto disable or constrain systems or agents that are working what that feature is. And then ultimately, like we do know that corporate insurance no longer will indemnify organizations against AI decisions. You are still accountable for the decisions that are being made. And this is part of that guardrail and observability story. So I think that when we hear like, hey, you know what, if you have this thing making decisions on behalf of your business and you are not operating in control, that is a risk to your business. And that's not just a CISO risk, that's the CEO and board level responsibility at that point.
And I think to what you said earlier, I think what's interesting about where the industry is right now is at least the industry is at a point where we can instrument for all of these new use cases from day one. It's not necessarily an afterthought in the sense that, at least we're mature enough that, say on the observability side, open telemetry or the extensions of that, like telemetry and projects like that would allow us at least from day one to instrument those things. Because to your point, the step one is observe. You can't, if you can't see it, there's no ability to put in the guardrails and whatnot. So I'm glad that those are generally industry practices that are established already, so that we can at least observe that, and then perhaps then move to the govern and the control pieces there.
Well, Martin, your comment makes me think about one thing. I get in a conversation with people and they're like, why do I need to have this expense inside my organization? And it was like, well, your observability is the equivalent of brakes in a car. Brakes are not there to stop your car. The brakes are there to make you go, allow you to go as fast as you need to go without killing yourself. And that's kind of what observability brings to the table. That, if you think about, like in the military, we have this thing called OODA loop, or observe, orient, decide, act. And that's the life cycle of why observability is the difference between, that's not an expense, it's a safety mechanism. So think about more of that perspective, because, CTOs, IDO leaders, CXOs, and any of these things should expect that as a baseline capability before you ever start to overlay AI. AI is now going to be introduced by your vendors. It's going to be introduced by your people. It's going to be introduced into your products. And if you don't have the ability to understand where you're exposed, ultimately that ends up being just part of the risk profile. It's not that you shouldn't be taking that risk out because there's significant value there. I just think that it's one of those things that needs to be understood at the outset. That's what guardrails brings for.
Awesome. So in this conversation, I feel like we've touched a lot on exactly why this is such a critical transition period for organizations and teams. So I'd love to close with something very practical for the leaders that are listening. Martin, you mentioned in your recent blog, Observability and Transition, that we're in this critical transition period. So I'm wondering from both of you, for all of the business leaders out there that are looking to set a solid foundation for trustworthy AI, do you have any other advice on what you would tell them to prioritize?
Yeah, the way we've been thinking about it in this transition period, and you can imagine as an observability vendor, we've been putting a lot of R&D investment into, almost the holy grail of observability, which is go and detect automatically for me what my issue is, and go and remediate it. And I think in that path, we found it to be equally as important, not just to tell the end user the answer, but almost bring them along for that ride, because it's the bringing them along for the ride that actually builds the trust. It's not the accuracy of the answer. The accuracy of the answer partially, but it's actually more the bringing them along to the thought process of perhaps how the AI agent or whatever feature it is went and determined that answer. And I would say part of it is showing the work, and then I'm sure that's a pretty common concept of show how it went there. But for us in the observability space, it's been actually going through step by step, because often these problems we're trying to solve are fairly complex, and jumping to the answer straight away doesn't make logical sense. It's almost like guiding them step by step through the process, and of course showing the work along the way, but also at least for observability, and I think this would probably apply to many other industries and use cases as well, also showing the things it ruled out, right? So like if you determined and checked that you think it's an infrastructure issue, also coming along and saying, hey, by the way, I also checked your recent deployments, I also checked the other applications, I also checked all these other things and ruled those out as options. To me, that's a lot of and again, if you take AI out of the story and just have a bunch of developers or SREs trying to solve a problem. That's the exact process we're going through. Like, what's the most probable next step or probable cause, and then what do I need to rule out in order to give myself confidence that this is the answer. So it's almost replicating that and bringing, I think, the humans along, because I do think there is this transitionary period. I don't know how long it's going to be, where trust does need to be built into these systems, especially they are going to get a little non-deterministic, and perhaps at least in the observability operational side of the house, that they're going to eventually have permissions to make changes to your systems, and systems that, as Thomas said earlier, insurance companies are maybe not going to indemnify you for. So there definitely doesn't to be this trust built up. So I would say, my advice would be to focus on that phase, and perhaps even slow down a little bit, so that your team can build up that trust, because I think that's going to be a required step before just jumping to the final stage there.
With that, I mean, I want to plus one area that you really kind of called out, and that's the notion of a narrative. Because the thing is that what I find is that, like, if you think, you go back to, early, AppD, Datadog, all these kind of tools that would confidently tell you the answer.
Yeah.
What I found is that as they started to evolve and the industry started to evolve, to give more of a narrative to people, to be able to understand why certain things, what was checked, how it was checked, how that decision was derived, and what the dependencies therein were, I think are really important. So I think that this notion of a modern observability or telemetry fabric in that regard, I think is really key for being able to, see how and what, what has been instrumented, how is it, metrics, logs, traces, topology, all of the kind of activities that you can get in there. I think the other aspect of this, and this is just kind of goes back to my notion around, we don't really start with tools, but a lot of organizations have tool spread. So, model management, prompt management, access control, logging, what does it mean to be able to have this integrating into your CI/CD stack? So Martin, you just mentioned this notion of like, what happened with the build? Well, the source of truth for the build is the CI/CD system. What has been pushed through? What is the changes that needed to be factored in? At ThoughtWorks, we evangelize secure by design. How do you move security as far left as possible in that process? And I think that if you have engineers on your team that have a appreciation for coding with a heightened risk profile, it removes the magic vibe coded, it worked, so therefore it should be fine kind of problem. That's actually very much an anti-pattern. We want to make sure that, when we work with our customers, we bring them along on that journey. And then, whether you're hardening your IDEs or the agents that you're working on one side, what are those tools that you want to be able to do? But you have to treat them ultimately as sensitive infrastructure. This is kind of the key, kind of ways of working for a team to be able to deliver at scale. And then the last area I think about is this like notion of like telemetry-backed governance. So that's kind of goes back to the guardrail story, moving away from like more use cases to fewer and better end-to-end journeys or narratives about what you would like to accomplish inside your system. So you're not in a scenario where you're, kind of loosely, your beliefs are loosely held, but then when they move to production, they're no longer loosely held; they're tightly held. So.
Awesome. That's a great wrap up. Thank you so much, Martin and Thomas, for offering your insights and predictions on where AI and observability is really headed as we move into the new year, and for offering your advice on building a foundation and scaling for AI. I'm Sophie from Chronosphere, and thank you for joining us in the Sphere, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.